We are pleased once again to be joined by one of our favorites, Gerald Posner, kind enough to join us. Big-time writer, investigative reporter, pharma. His, of course, most recent book, which we've talked about a lot the last several months. But largely today, eventually, Gerald, as we welcome you, I want to talk about the book you wrote that came out, I think, in 2003. But let's set a little historical perspective here. Let's go back first to September 11, 2001. Where were you, and what do you remember about what you experienced on that day?
I was living in New York City, in Manhattan, together with my wife, Tricia. We had been there since 1978, and we were about to leave the apartment that morning. We were watching the Today Show at a time when you still watched morning TV shows, and Katie Couric and Brian Gumbel said, "Oh, by the way, we'll be back in just a moment with an author who has a new book out, a biography on Howard Hughes." And we sort of said to each other, "A book on Howard Hughes, how could that be new?" So we stayed until the next break, and it was in that break that they came in with the actual news break that said, by the way, a small plane, they thought at that time a private plane, had hit one of the World Trade Center towers. And we started watching the news, and that morning unfurled. We could see the smoke eventually from the World Trade Towers looking south from our Midtown apartment. And we wandered out a couple of hours later after that news came in. I didn't believe it. Trish came in to me at one point and said, they have a report that hundreds of firemen are dead at the World Trade Center in the collapse of the building. And I said, Trish, you had to have heard it wrong. It's impossible. It couldn't be hundreds. You know, the numbers were so staggering. And when we walked out that day into Manhattan, walked around, the thing that struck us right away, Dan, was that the city that is normally so noisy, it's this cacophony of noises, sirens, horns, people talking, screaming, bicyclists going by. It was just dead silent. We were all wandering around like in a daze. And then you started to see the people walking up from downtown who were covered in ash, who were literally making their ways back over the Queensboro Bridge at 59th Street. And it was like an army of silent people. It was one of those days that literally, when people say, "I'll never forget it," we will never forget
it. When I listened to interviews from others who were in New York at the time, either close by the towers or elsewhere, it almost seemed to come in stages. At least that's what I've heard, where at first it's just the utter shock and also still curiosity about, well, how does this make any sense? Because it was almost a test of imagination that there would be any group capable of doing this. And then there was the next wave in which reality set in, that yes, planes into both buildings. This is no accident. This is something orchestrated. This is basically an attack on the United States.
So interesting as you say that, because it's exactly how the feelings played out that morning. I mean, in the beginning, we thought it was just an accident. And as a matter of fact, didn't even realize it was a commercial jumbo airliner. When you looked at the hole, what looked like the hole in the first of the World Trade Center towers, you don't realize how big that hole actually is. So it looks like it was made by a small plane. There was actually a pilot who had seen the plane fly over, and one of the news channels had him on in the morning before the second plane hit. And he said, "I saw that plane fly overhead. It was a jumbo." And you know, I said to Tricia, it couldn't have been a jumbo, right? It had to be a plane on the way to the Hamptons or some such place. And so you're thinking of it as a mistake. Then when the second tower is hit by the plane flying in, it's just like a punch in the stomach, because there's this realization in an instant that what you've been thinking is an accident is actually an attack, is planned, is part of a terror playing out in front of you. And that feeling was absolutely devastating. I think that for all of us, that realization of the second plane as it hit and then it was reported was the moment at which it changed entirely.
And did you end up then staying in New York for the next foreseeable future, a few weeks, or what were the days like as everything did indeed sink in and we get a better idea of the level of damage that is involved here?
We went about an hour and a half, 2 hours after the initial attacks had been reported. We wandered over to a nearby blood bank that was about 8 blocks away from us, and they weren't taking any blood. They said, by the way, we don't have any calls for it. They didn't think there was any need. That was sort of the realization, my God, they may not be dealing with injured. They may just be dealing with people who are dead. And what we did for the next several days, for nearly a week, we just went downtown and sort of volunteered our services for whatever we could do. There was a point at which first responders were still going in. They had it cordoned off so the perimeter was wide. You weren't able to get too nearby, but you were able to do things like pass along all of the goods that were being handled, the food that was going to first servers. You would be able to do things for the crews that were around. So you made yourself feel as though it was somehow useful. One night we were tired and we were sitting down next to a group of other people who had been volunteers. One of them turned out to be a student at NYU. We started to talk to her and we said, what are you doing here? And she just said, I feel compelled to do something, as many of us did. And she said, what do you do? And we told her we were journalists. And she said to us in this light bulb moment, meaning it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And she said, well, if you're a journalist, what are you doing here? Why aren't you trying to find out what happened? And I thought to myself, that makes sense. How is it possible that, this attack on America took place and the intelligence agencies that we have that are supposedly the best in the world didn't have any idea of what happened? And that's sort of the incentive to go off and start the process of, why America slept. What took place that allowed this attack to happen? And should we have known about it? And could we have done better? And that was it. It was literally a comment from another person. And I'll say one other thing. There was in the beginning in New York, and I'm sure this was the case around the country, but in New York in particular, for a few weeks, there was this sense of unity, of mission. We were all bound together by having been on the side that had been attacked in this terror attack. We were Americans suddenly. It didn't matter if you're Democrats or Republicans, if you happened to like the president, if you didn't like the president, or what you thought. That unity was really remarkable, brought together by a terrible tragedy. Now, over time, you started to feel that peel away, and then differences started to come out. It's hard to imagine what that's like. Maybe it was the same after Pearl Harbor, in the way that people felt, but it was a unique experience that literally would be hard to imagine being replicated again unless there was another tremendous tragedy.
Let's talk then a little bit about the book. I happen to find, and I actually have it here. I still have the hardcover. You probably sent it. It's probably too dark. Oh, there we go. Not a bad. The reflection's a little tough. Why America Slept, and the underline, the failure to prevent 9/11. And I went back and I happened to find, I think, one of the early New York Times reviews of the book, which was very favorable. And they made an interesting point, I thought, that largely to that point, you had made your career on debunking conspiracy theories as it pertains to JFK, MLK assassination as well. And they felt that in this book, you were going in the other direction, confirming and throwing out conspiracy theories. I like to think your approach is, and this is why I've loved having you on for years and respect your work, is you just try to follow the story. That's your point. That's your job. And that in attempting to do that and piecing together what happened and where our failures were, that's where you were led. That was the direction in which you were led.
Yeah, I always say that as a nonfiction writer, you're a hostage to the facts. You have to follow the evidence. The evidence takes you to the story. You might like the story to be different, or maybe you think the story is going to be X, Y, and Z, and it turns out to be quite the opposite. In this case, the first part of the story tends to be the first 10 years leading up to 9/11, because we had plenty of warnings that something was amiss when it came to Islamic terrorism. I mean, from the time of the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, we had the TWA 800, explosion that had taken place in 96. And we had the attacks on the African embassies in 98. We had the Egyptian airliner 990 that took place in 1999, the attacks on the Cole. We had Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu. So there were plenty of warnings that Islamic fundamentalism was a great problem. I think we took our eye off the ball, we meaning the United States and the federal government, after the Murrah building bombings in 1995, when Tim McVeigh, a survivalist right-wing militia, blew up the federal building. All of a sudden, it was that became the focus, and we forgot about Islamic terrorism to a large extent. They didn't forget about us. The failed attempt to bring down the World Trade Center in 93 was still on their agenda. It was their mark of what they wanted to do. And the facts that later led to what you said, the Times talks about as a conspiracy theory, is the idea that I had based on my work in my reporting in 2002 and 2003, that the Saudis, some members of the royal family, and the Pakistani military at a fairly high level had at least foreknowledge of the attack on America, and they told no one. And that's based upon what was confidential sources describing the contents of an interrogation of one of the top Al-Qaeda militants that we caught in 2002, a guy called Abu Zubaydah, who's still down in Guantanamo and hasn't been tried yet. So the questions I raised that are raised at the end of the book are, were the Saudis involved? Were they just Saudi officials who happened to be supporters of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden? Or did it involve members of the government? We didn't know. And what about the Pakistani military? And since then, I think there has been plenty of additional smoke from families that have continued lawsuits and from other reporters that have kept up on the work that now make it quite clear that the US government has been reticent to disclose what it might know about the potential of Saudi or Pakistani involvement. Biden's recently ordered the intelligence agencies to go ahead and release the documents or at least review them. Maybe we'll find out the truth in the coming years.
Do you expect that there's any chance there will be really conclusive evidence through those documents if they come out, or are you skeptical?
I'm skeptical. I mean, I'll be absolutely shocked if those documents show the truth. And the reason I say that is, in part, American investigators have missed the opportunity to follow up on the leads that were critical in the early stages. They let some members of the Saudi diplomatic missions and some Saudi diplomats who had questionable ties and might have been some of the funders and had ties to two of the hijackers in California before the 9/11 took place. They let them leave the country, and then the Saudis wouldn't let us interview them later. They wouldn't let the FBI involved at all. When we picked up the terrorist I mentioned before, this fellow called Abu Zubaydah, he had 2 bank cards in his possession. We picked him up in 2002, only a year after the attacks in Pakistan. One of the bank cards is for a bank in the Kuwait, and the other one is for a Saudi bank, an institution that had some questionable ties to possible funding of terrorism. Well, by the time the U.S. asked for the information on those transactions in the bank, all of it was swept up by the Saudis, who'd closed off the financial doors to that. That investigation was stymied. So I don't even know if our documents contain the full answers, much less be able to disclose them.
Another large component of the book is what might be described as a conspiracy of silence, having to do with the individuals you identify and develop as characters in the United States government who were attempting to sound warnings, who were trying to get the attention of presidents of the United States to say this stuff is real. Identify who some of those individuals are and why you concluded it was so difficult for them to seemingly get to the right places or get people who counted interested in enough to try to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic to think that in Minneapolis, St. Paul, right, in the state in which you're broadcasting from, an FBI field officer is trying to get the attention repeatedly of headquarters and FBI to report about a person that she thinks could have some questionable ties and maybe be a militant and possibly a security threat. He turns out to be what we called for a while the 20th hijacker. And nobody at headquarters wanted anything to do with it. They kept closing down her attempts to get a secure warrant. They closed down her attempts to be able to get actually access to tap the telephone and follow what he was doing. It would have led back to some of the financiers back in Europe who were funding the 9/11 attack and a possibility to have stopped it. So that was closed off at the bureau level. The same thing happened not just at the bureau, but at the CIA. So the CIA actually followed 2 of the eventual hijackers into the country in late 1999, a guy called Al-Midar and Al-Hamzi. They went to a terrorist convention, I know, not advertised as a convention we would think of, but one that took place in Malaysia. The CIA said to the Malaysian intelligence agency, by the way, we're interested in what these fellows might be talking about because we didn't know, they weren't on our radar. Will you please monitor this sort of gathering of terrorists? The Malaysians went ahead and made videotape, but they didn't have any sound. So we don't know what they talked about, but we had them on videotape. The CIA then knew what they looked like. They created files for them. These 2 fellows flew into the US, into California. The CIA knew it at the time. They ended up going to San Diego, where they got driver's license in their own names. One of them was listed in the phone book. They had contacts with some Saudi officials, and the CIA told no one. They didn't tell the INS. They didn't tell the FBI, who they're supposed to notify at that time, that maybe there's a security threat with these two people. It wasn't until August the 23rd of 2001, so think about this, we're talking just 18 days before the attacks on America, that the CIA finally says internally, you know what? These two people that came in that we think could be related to international terrorism, and we don't know where they are because they lost track of them, maybe we should tell someone. They told the INS. So the INS then tells the FBI, they start to look for them. They can't find them before 9/11. If they had been notified or they told the FAA, believe it or not, they took the plane reservations for 9/11. One of them was a pilot. They made those plane reservations in their real names. We would have had them on the no-fly list. 9/11 could have been stopped. So there are so many opportunities where people inside law enforcement and the intelligence agencies wanted to do more, and they were stymied by the bureaucracy, and we ended up letting it fall through the cracks. It's just infuriating.
These examples strike me as why I think you wrote in the book that you end up being, as you're putting your reporting together, infuriated when you have several examples like this at various levels that cry out to you that, as tragic as this was, especially because as tragic as it was, we had real ways to perhaps prevent it or limit the damage.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Look, even as far back as 1990, when a militant Rabbi Kahana, who's head of the Jewish Defense League, was killed in New York by a young Arab, this guy Nosser, and the FBI had pictures of Nosser at a shooting range in New York. They never identified any of the other people. If they had, they would have found out there was a link to the first World Trade Center bombings and a link to one of the financiers for 9/11. Now, what I have to say is, of course, Monday morning, we always know what went wrong when we look backwards. Right. It's simple. So we know the attacks took place. Now I'm looking back and doing my reporting, and I see the gaps in what could have been done better. So it's not a perfect system. And often the men and women who are serving the United States in intelligence and law enforcement, they'll make a mistake. They're human. I get that. But in this case, it was a systemic failure in the sense that the system itself had failed. We had taken our eye off during the Clinton administration for an 8-year period on Islamic terrorism. And as a result, not only was it allowed to grow, to become more of a threat and eventually make the 9/11 attack, but in addition, those who were involved in intelligence and law enforcement had no incentive to make it a priority. Instead, they were worried about the Ruby Ridges of the world. They were worried about the Wacos of the world. Those were the issues that tended to dominate. As a result, that was a gift to those who were planning the 9/11 attack.
Another big component, a piece of this, we talked about just yesterday with Michael Hurley. Michael Hurley was a CIA officer, career CIA officer, who had ended up with 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan after 9/11, and ultimately ended up on the 9/11 Commission as one of the chief counsels, did a lot of the writing for that report. And one of the things he reminded me of yesterday was that this was also a stretch, and I guess this isn't new, but you're talking about the bureaucracy, the lack of cooperation when it comes to information sharing between various agencies, CIA and FBI included, a huge flaw that also contributed to the likelihood that we ended up where we were on 9/11.
No question about it. And as a matter of fact, the counterterrorism organization inside the CIA, the group that really went against terrorism, wasn't even formed until 1986, after we had the bombings in the Marine barracks. And so from 86 and on, the CIA has a special unit that's focused just on terrorism. The FBI has their own group that's focused on trying to stop international terror and links into the US. You would think they'd be talking to each other, but I understand the way the bureaucracies work on this. They tend to develop their own sources. They have their own means of information. They've got their confidential informants, and they share and guard those jealously. It's as if it's gold. They don't want to share the information with another agency or another group because they're afraid they're giving up their own sources of information on that. Now, it sounds crazy because we're all working toward the same goal, but they have their own turfs, their own little areas to protect. And as a result, they very reluctantly cooperate with one another. And that is to our detriment and to the benefit of those working against us, because in this case, time and time again, you see instances in which, if that cooperation had taken place, then one agency would have taken the information from another and said, oh, by the way, you might not think that's important, but we have something over here that indicates it is. And they could have put pieces of the puzzle together beforehand instead of afterwards.
Why do you conclude, in your view, was Bill Clinton as disinterested as he sometimes seemed to be?
I think that, I'm, as you know, a pretty equal opportunity castigator of both political parties, Democrats and Republicans.
Indeed.
And I've wondered often, in a speculation, what would have happened if the 8 years from 92 to 2000 had been a Republican presidency? What if it had been George Bush instead? Or what if, Bush the elder had won a re-election and then George Bush the younger had taken the second 4 years? And the same events had taken place in terms of the attacks on the Cole, the attacks on the East African embassies, Flight 800. Would the response have been very different? I'm not sure if it would have been. It might have been just the same, because what the Clinton administration did was they fell into this cycle, and it was abetted by the mainstream media, so that literally in many ways that 95 is a turning point in the early years of the Clinton administration to turn away from Islamic terrorism as a focus of our attention and to bring it instead to domestic terrorism. And one of the reasons was that CBS, Dan Rather, had a report when the Murrah building bombing had first taken place. They had a great analyst on, Steve Emerson. He did a book called Jihad in America. He exposed the extent to which radical Islam was here in the States. And he gave Rather, as a commentary about Oklahoma before McVeigh was caught, that had all the earmarks of Islamic terrorism. It looked like a truck bombing. It's how they operate. That report went out, and sort of the press picked up on it. Once McVeigh was arrested, the press backpedaled, as they had to. It was incorrect. And they were so apologetic for the fact that they first pointed a finger at Islamic terrorism, they went out of their way in the future not to do so. And as a result, Islamic terrorism fell off the radar. The Clinton administration may have been more susceptible to public opinion and overnight polls than any other modern American administration, certainly one that we had never had. They actually did overnight polling after the Cole was attacked and after the attacks were made on the East African embassy to find out if the American people were in the mood for a big response. And they found out that people wanted a strong response, but not necessarily one that committed troops or anything else. So Clinton, in each instance, sent off, he would send off cruise missiles from sea. They would hit remote areas of Afghanistan or the Sudan, and in one case, a factory, and we would say that was the retaliation. But you can't do overnight polling to determine what your response should be to a terror attack. And so I think that what it told Osama bin Laden and the other terror leaders was the United States was weak. They would never respond aggressively. And as a result, they were the big giant that you could attack and never worry about being eliminated yourself. Our response of going into Afghanistan, the invasion in Afghanistan to get rid of the Taliban and then to look for Osama bin Laden was a shock to them. They never thought the U.S. would commit troops on the ground.
Were we wrong to leave now? Let's bring it 20 years forward from 9/11. Were we wrong, or was this just inevitable that sooner or later, whoever the president was going to have to look the American people in the eye and say, man, we cannot nation build the way we want to believe we can, and maybe even the way we have led you to believe we were. It can't stay this open-ended. We need to leave. Or are we doomed to eventually be forced to go back into it again if indeed you buy the notion that this could end up being a terrorist hotbed once more?
I mean, there's little doubt that at some stage you're going to have an American president say, enough, we can't stay. This isn't like having troops in South Korea or in Germany where there's no shooting going on, and you can have a group of troops there and they serve as a buffer purpose but you're not actually worried about combat. The problem is that the planning for the exit is an unmitigated disaster. And you're getting, I don't care, if only a few people in the military or intelligence communities are giving you the advice that it could fall like a house of cards. You have to plan for the worst possible emergency. And clearly the Biden administration, they made the calculation, incorrectly as it turns out, that Kabul will stay under the control of President Ghani and the Afghan army, and we will be able to do an orderly withdrawal under the protection of that army, because there's no way that these two sides, Taliban and the Afghans, won't fight each other for a while. Remember when the Soviets left? People often forget when the Soviets left, the Civil War went on for 2 years before the Taliban took control of the country. So the same was expected here, I think, is that calculation. But that is solely on the Biden administration. It would be on any administration that did it. The way we got out, absolutely terrible. You look at it and you just shake your head. It's hard to imagine the errors that were made along the way, how much easier and smoother it could have been. As to whether we'll ever go back in, I heard Senator Lindsey Graham the other day say, oh, we're going back in. You know what? You might as well just grab a crystal ball or a group of tarot cards and take a guess. Who knows? Because we don't know.
How much, in your view, has the terrorist threat changed from what we were enduring and dealing with in the wake of 9/11? Because not everything stays the same. There are different groups that emerge with different objectives. So how different is the I guess you could say the landscape compared to then?
Yeah, the landscape is definitely different. I mean, we've gone through, think of this. I mean, from the time of 9/11 to today, we went through the emergence and the growth, and for a while, the flourishing of a caliphate, an actual Muslim, territory that covered 3 countries and was run by ISIS, and then the fall of that caliphate. So, a lot has taken place. I think that I am in contact sometimes with law enforcement and intelligence sources in the EU. They are still on guard for terror attacks there in the EU because they know a number of the fighters from the caliphate who were Europeans who left in the UK and France and Germany and other places have returned. They may, in fact, make a strike against the countries. They may not. The United States is always the greatest of the targets. We are the great Satan. Israel is the little Satan. And then the rest of Europe is, part of the bad offensive as well. So what we've done with the Taliban is by allowing them to come back into power so quickly, by allowing them to arm themselves to some extent with the United States gear to have a victory parade in Kandahar as it was, we've given them great face, as I call it. We've given them respect inside the Islamic terror world. So the Al-Qaedas of the world, the ISISes of the world, who may not think the Taliban are strict enough, they aren't radical enough, believe it or not, they aren't really ready to wage jihad all the time, still will find Afghanistan a very welcome place. And that's the real thing. We don't have the caliphate anymore. You're going to find radical Islamists, even from Africa and Boko Haram, sometimes it may make their way there. The real question is, will they be content to fight among themselves and to carry on terrorism just in the EU and in the Middle East, or will it find its way to our shores? We are really, really silly and have learned nothing from history if we don't think at some point we are not on the target list for some of these groups as a high list.
Is there a leader at bin Laden's level who seems to have that sort of authority and power and, dare I say it, imagination? Does anybody exist in that world now, or we just aren't as familiar with the names?
Yeah, no, I mean, 2 things I think happen. There will always be somebody like that. With ISIS, we had it with al-Baghdadi. He became that person. And the question is, when you get a charismatic leader, so you have somebody who doesn't just say the right things and isn't just somebody who puts together the entire group, but somehow has the charisma to speak to the followers and to bring in new recruits and to give them a cause and a purpose. So we've seen that happen with ISIS. We saw it originally with bin Laden. And there may be a period in which there's a vacuum in which nobody comes up to that. And don't think, by the way, I think one of the mistakes we make, our enemies meaning the radical Islam, they view the United States as this cohesive force that is just out doing the same thing. Everybody in America agrees on the same foreign policy, and that they don't realize how splintered we are often, how we're in these opposing camps. And even within the Taliban or within ISIS or Al-Qaeda, there are different strains, as there are in the Revolutionary Guards and in Iran and in other countries, between the hardliners, those who want to raise jihad and use their power to go ahead and fight outside, and those who say, no, let's use it inside to enforce Sharia law and stay away from the rest of the world and make this into a 14th century theocracy. So those forces will battle it out, and one of them will emerge as the dominant force with a charismatic leader. We just don't know who it is yet.
Let's bring it full circle here and talk about what you observed about New York as someone who was living there with your wife at the time. Um, I think a lot of us on the outside who've visited there, but obviously haven't lived there, there did come across this sort of I don't know, strength, tenacity, almost a bleep you sort of quality to the response at every level. And maybe that would have happened in any city that might have been hit. I don't know. It might not be fair to say that's just about New York. But what did you observe about that? What did you learn about New York maybe that you didn't already know post 9/11?
I think what I learned, there was that, the old Frank Sinatra song, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, right? And so New Yorkers like to think of themselves, and I haven't lived there now for 15 or 16 years, but when we were there, you'd like to think of yourself as you can do anything, you're the toughest, you're going to make it through. And so that resiliency did show. But I also agree with you that if it had been Indianapolis or Dallas or Los Angeles, we would have seen a similar resiliency take place. The one thing that New York had going for it, which was very important, was the end of the Rudolph Giuliani mayor's term. And sometimes a political leader steps up to the moment. Churchill did in World War II. Roosevelt did. Sometimes somebody shows that they're really the right person at the right time. And Giuliani was the right mayor for New York City at that disaster. He had responded and gone down to the World Trade Center early that day. He saw the people jumping off the building who couldn't wait and coming down, and it affected him. He set up that war room, and he ran it in a way of not just giving talks and let's have another update on what's happening, but he took charge in a way that made all of us in the city, those who liked Giuliani, those who didn't, feel as though he was really the mayor. He became America's mayor as a result of that, because he gave you that sense of confidence that even though this is a disaster, we will be coming out of this and we will find those responsible.
It's funny you bring him up, because you when you factor in where he is now and how he has evolved, it feels like it is a different universe. It's a completely different perception of him. I think he's earned the new perception, quite frankly. But it's so utterly foreign, and people who maybe weren't old enough on 9/11, they're probably, if they're listening to this, they're saying, "What? The same Rudy Giuliani that we know of now was the guy who was sort of the stabilizing, a guy with great will and great iron who showed such fortitude." They probably don't even believe it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, sometimes I'll get in a conversation with somebody and I'll say, I was in New York at the time and Giuliani was a great mayor. And they say, and they're either too young to know him, or they're just like, they say, "Oh, you got to be kidding. What are you, crazy?" And I say, "No, it's hard to imagine. It was like it was a different person." And it goes to show you that you can squander the great goodwill that you build up if over time your behavior is a little squirrely and bad, because Giuliani had this tremendous goodwill that was built up and over a period of 20 years then lost it. But not only, if you had come to me, Dan, in 2002, 2003, when I was working on the book on Why America Slept, and you said to me, "Okay, let's go forward, 20th anniversary, what are we going to be looking at?" And you said to me, "Giuliani will be viewed as this fringe guy who's sort of out there and does crazy things and everything else." I would say, "Really? I don't think so." And then you said, "Okay, I'll tell you something else. We will be out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban, even including some of the original players from the late 90s, will be back in control." I'd say, "You're absolutely mad. That will never happen." So I never say never, but there's no better example of never say never than this torturous last 20 years where we end up in this situation. And one of the best indicators, by the way, that the Biden administration, Biden himself, made a completely wrong assessment of what was taking place, is they knew politically the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up. They want to participate in that. The president wants to be at that, at the memorial. He wants to be with the victims' families and reiterate the commitment to, keeping America safe. If he had really considered the idea that he would have to face 9/11 with the Taliban back in control, it was a calculation that nobody would have wanted to make. And then we forget sometimes that Biden was the one senior in terms of the political leadership of the Obama administration, that was against making the raid to kill Osama bin Laden because he thought it was too high risk. So there is a risk-adverse nature to this president. And in this case, it's just played out in the most catastrophic ways for him politically as well.
One of the things that I found the most frustrating, I guess, is as I understand it, the whole idea about the withdrawal was we want to work around, we want to be out by the anniversary, by September 11, 2021. And, I understand politicians are politicians. They always are in times of peace, in times of war, the whole bit. They're always calculating that way, as cynical as that might sound. That said, that was to me one of the signs here that you're kind of making this up as you go, because almost immediately the pushback was, no, you don't want to mess with that date because it's sacred. So, well, what are we going to do? Well, we'll move it up a couple weeks. And suddenly it becomes September 1 instead. And you're going, how can logistically this make any sense? No matter how confident you are that the government's going to hold, you actually put more pressure on a situation that is very challenging, even if you do it right. And that I found as infuriating as anything regarding what seemed to be the focus for the Biden administration on, okay, when can we, quote unquote, when's the best time to give a speech regarding the fact that we are now out, mission accomplished, so to speak, 20 years later?
Yeah, no. It's a disaster on so many different levels. And, I've been to Afghanistan. I was there 10 years ago. I'm in contact now with Afghans who are getting in touch with me on Telegraph and Signal, who have SIV applications pending. One of them has a sister who's an American citizen. She's Afghan. She's still in Kabul. She went several times to the airport and is one of the Americans who was unable to get out. They are absolutely petrified. There's, but they're very safe because they don't want their phones found and looked at by somebody, by the Taliban. The fact that we have left, these people behind, and they are just a few of hundreds and hundreds, is so frustrating. But in addition, there were easier ways. So people look at this and they say, oh, no matter how we got out, it was going to be terrible. But that's not true at all. Anybody who's ever seen Bagram Air Force Base, let me tell you, it was a small city. It was an Air Force base like no other. There were perimeters after perimeters to try to get near the inside. It was protected so that no suicide attack could take place that would ever hit American troops. And inside that base, we not only had the largest amount of military equipment outside of Saudi Arabia, but we also had two runways as opposed to the one runway that's at the commercial airport. We could have run an evacuation program through Bagram Air Force Base in a military sense and been able to do it whether the Taliban liked it or not. But we gave Bagram up weeks before Kabul fell because we had decided already we didn't need Bagram. Not because, as the president said, he was advised by his military advisors that they really didn't need Bagram. No, the reason they couldn't keep Bagram and keep troops in Kabul to keep the embassy is they didn't have enough troops left in Afghanistan. They'd already taken it down by too much. They would have had to send troops back in. So Biden had to decide which was more important. Do we keep Bagram or do we keep the embassy? Let's keep the embassy. The embassy should be the last part. It's the American territory. Remember, an embassy is the territory of the country it represents. The last thing that comes down is the flag over the embassy in that country. And in this case, we didn't have enough troops to even keep the embassy. We had to give that up beforehand so that the ISIS flag, or in this case, the Taliban flag, was able to go up, and we were only then at the airport. The way this was done looks to me, and I keep hearing the reports from the administration, this is the largest airlift in history. And I think all you have to do is change one word. This is the largest retreat in history. You almost have the same thing. Dunkirk was a great retreat in World War II. British troops trapped by Germans. They didn't come in and capture all those British. They let them get away, in essence. That was a great success for the Brits. Not really. It was a retreat, but they did get them out. We got 130,000 people out. That's to our credit. We left some behind. That's to our shame. But there's no other way of describing this, that to the Afghans, to the Taliban, to ISIS, to Al-Qaeda, this is the largest retreat in history by the biggest military power ever.
It's the old, if you have contributed to starting the fire, it's going to be limited how much credit you're going to get for then finding a way to put out the fire within reason. I mean, it's if you're a part of the problem on the front end, I don't think people are that interested in patting you on the back for what you did to react to the situation that you contributed to. Let's finish up with this. Well, go ahead. I was going to say.
I was just going to say, and two quick things. If you put some blame on in the past, early on when Bush went into Afghanistan, there was a moment at which we had Osama bin Laden trapped in Tora Bora, the mountain range. And there was a question as to whether we could bomb the hell out of that range and literally be able to kill him then. That would have been possibly the end of the hunt for bin Laden. We decided not to because the civilian casualties might be too high with the villagers who lived in there. That was a strategic error. In the Obama administration, Obama did the surge, as it was called, under General McChrystal. That surge was tremendously successful. The Taliban had tremendous injuries. They had a death rate, which was their highest ever in the war. They backed up into these mountain areas. But then the civilian death toll was high enough, and the president stopped the surge. And McChrystal got replaced after he gave a bad interview to Rolling Stone where he said something wrong. So you look at the earlier presidents, there were these sort of moments at which maybe things could have gone differently, but they didn't. So it ends up here today.
You mentioned the unity of the entire country post 9/11 and how almost ancient that feels given to where we are. Mike Hurley with me yesterday was saying part of the heartening thing for him regarding working on the 9/11 Commission was what he thought was great cooperation between the Republican and Democratic leadership on that occasion, even though there are people who've been critical of some aspects of that report. And it's just interesting. It struck me that you brought the same thing up in a different context just post 9/11, as a couple of observers have been around for a while. And it is hard to see where we come back together again with those two examples of maybe being times where there was at least some effort to get some stuff to rise above the politics of it. Are we ever going to get back to that place, and how difficult does it make? In other words, let's say we had, God forbid the thought, another 9/11, would we come together? Is there any chance we would come together the same way, or would we be going back to our tribes almost as soon as it happened?
Well, I'll tell you, if we had the equivalent of another 9/11, if we had a dirty bomb attack or a radiation attack, a chemical attack, and we did not come together, and Democrats and Republicans did not work in joint fashion, then we are really doomed. This tribalism is the worst many of us who have followed politics for years can recall. This bitter tribalism when we're in camp, oppose the other side and want our side, Democrats or Republicans, to win at the ballot box, but want the other side not just to lose, but if they do win, to fail, even though they're failing for America. If we can't get over that when the country has been attacked and be unified as Americans, no matter how different we are, then for this country, that would be, one of the worst possible signs. We are a nation, a young nation that has nothing. There's nothing in common. We don't have a common religion. Yeah, we're Judeo-Christian, but we don't have a common religion. We didn't start out with a common ethnic background. We're a bunch of immigrants, came over to escape the king. And then over time, we're a nation of immigrants, and we're bound together by this amorphous idea somehow of America, whatever that means. And we're proud to be Americans. And that idea, but if we get to a stage where we're in such tribal factions that we have an attack take place, and you have people in Iowa that say, I don't know if I want to fight for those people in California that are for transgender rights, and somebody in California is for transgender rights. Said, I don't know if I want to fight for those people in Texas who are for restrictions on abortion. You start to get into that where people are making choices about who are Americans, then we have no identity at all.
You mentioned, by the way, that you're in touch with some individuals in Afghanistan still trying to get out. So that must be harrowing to talk to them, and frustrating, because I assume there's only so much you can do. What do you try to do? Do you try to put them in contact with people? Because I know there have been a lot of private groups that have former military that have attempted to just do their own rescue operations, some of them quite successfully. What is your approach? What's your strategy?
I did give them a website in one instance of one of the private groups, but my general advice is to wait to see if the United States or the European Union will be able to arrange exits that can take place in the coming months. Look at the one thing that Taliban needs. They need money. They need the billions of dollars that are sitting in European coffers and American coffers that were going to go to the old Afghan government. So President Ghazni, when he fled the country with $180 million or whatever it was in his suitcases, there was more money that would have been coming into his personal cash if he had waited. Unfortunately, he didn't get to steal that. The Taliban would like that. They won't get any of it. They won't get any humanitarian assistance. They won't get international aid. They won't have all of the groups coming in for the UN if they just take a hardline position. So there may be a window opening possible in the next few months where some people may be able to travel. But I've also urged them to stay low key and to just try to go about their daily business without making any contact or raising any issue for themselves. It's very frustrating, I must say, because I feel so powerless. You're right. What can I do? I was in contact. I was sending emails back and forth when the U.S. Embassy was, when consular and diplomatic officers were working out of the airport. They got in contact with the American the citizen who's there, the Afghan woman. She had gone to the airport on 3 different days and was unable to get to the front. On a 4th day, she got to the front and was turned away because it was too crowded. She didn't know about the warning. When the State Department put out a warning that said, don't go to the airport because we're afraid about an imminent terror attack before the attack took place, she wasn't aware of that. I told her brother that she should not go to the airport that day. She didn't. That's the day the terror attack took place. So we think the State Department puts out a warning that says, by the way, don't go to the airport because there might be a terror attack. Not every Afghan hears it. Not everybody's watching the BBC. Not everybody's listening to, Voice of America. So it's a chaotic situation. And in the first week after the Taliban had taken Kabul, the most disturbing notes I would get from this family was that it's not the Taliban in charge. It's not the police who had been here, and it's not the government, but it's almost like a bit of no one. And there are thieves wandering around. So there was a 5 or 6 day period where it was like a bad horror movie. And that was really, the worst.
Gerald, thanks for the extended time as always. Excellent work. And I appreciate you taking as much time as you did. And we, as always, we'll certainly try to stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I hope to talk to you next time, maybe with a Taliban-free government, but I don't know if that's going to take place for a long time.
I'm afraid you're probably right about that. Thanks again, sir. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.